About God, I'm tormented in two ways. First, in considering whether God exists, I should know what kind of God I'm considering. Second, if God does exist, I'd want to know everything possible about God. Both ways of thinking lead me to this. God, to be God, I'm told, has to be perfect. What does it mean for God to be perfect? Perfectly good? Perfectly powerful? Perfectly perfect? So, did God create the perfect world? Our world perfect? That'd be hard to believe. So, is God perfect? I'm Robert Lawrence Kuhn, and Closer to Truth is my journey to find out. I begin in Oxford with the Nolof Professor of the Philosophy of the Christian Religion, Brian Leftow. Brian specializes in the metaphysics of God, God's profound, mysterious traits. If you think this medieval, think again.
Brian, how do we understand the idea that God is perfect?
Well, there are certain traits we think of as making something good or valuable. It's a good thing to have knowledge. It's a good thing to have power. It's a good thing to be morally good. Those things come in different degrees. If you extend the degree higher and higher and higher, some of those things have kind of an intrinsic maximum. So to say that God is perfect is to say that he has qualities like this in their absolute maximum degree. Some good qualities may not have intrinsic maxima. In other words, maybe for every beautiful thing, there could be something even more beautiful than that. Who knows? But with some others, you can see where a maximum is just a natural consequence of what's involved. For instance, knowledge. Knowledge has to be of the truth, of the way things really are. There is just one way things really are, just one body of truth, and it's got limits. This is true, and what's the contradictory of it isn't true. So there's a maximum amount of truths, namely all of them. And so there's a maximum amount of knowledge, namely knowledge of all of that.
So the concept of perfection deals with a host of different qualities that if they have a maximum, God has them. And if they don't have a maximum, God has as much as is possible?
Well, if they don't have a maximum, there isn't such a thing as having as much as possible. If they don't have a maximum, then the concept of a perfect being isn't committed to God's having the maximum of them. It's just committed to his being very good in those respects.
Why is it important for God to be perfect on this human description?
We worship God. When you worship, you praise God, you say that he's great. And you don't sort of have a mental reservation as to the effect, well, yeah, you're great, but I can think of better. The attitude of worship is really praise without reservations. What would an object have to be to really deserve that? It would have to be good without qualification.
God's perfection, apparently, subsumes God's goodness, God's power, and God's knowledge, but not, it seems, God creating a perfect world. So God is perfect, but not what God creates. I sense here tension. God's acclaimed perfection brings about both the threat of contradiction, which would negate God's existence, and the thrill of exhilaration, which would magnify God's nature. This is high-risk, high-return theology, and I love it. Still in Oxford, I pursue God's perfection with the former Nolof professor, the distinguished analytic philosopher who argues for God, Richard Swinburne.
Richard, do you believe in God?
Yes.
Do you believe that God is omnipotent?
Yes.
Do you believe that God is perfectly good?
Yes.
And therefore, don't you conclude that God made the best possible world?
No, I don't, for the reason that there couldn't be a best possible world. It's not logically possible that there be a best possible world, because any world that God might have made, there is a better world that he could have made instead. A simple reason for this. Humans are a good thing, so the more humans, the better. So clearly not all concentrated on Earth, but spread around an infinite universe. Now, he's got to make some number of humans. Suppose he makes 1 trillion humans, and they all have nice, good lives. It would be a better universe if he'd made 1,000,001,001,001 humans, and so on forever. You might think, well, this could be solved by supposing he could make an infinite number of humans. But you can always add to an infinite number of humans by making another one. So whatever universe God makes, it wouldn't be the best of all possible worlds, because there couldn't be a best of all possible world.
Okay, and if God has not made the best of all possible worlds, how then can you define God's perfection?
God's perfection consists in doing nothing bad, in making many good things. A good being will spread goodness. He will make lots of it. He can't make a maximum, because there isn't a maximum, but he'll make lots of it, and he'll do nothing bad, and that's what perfection consists in.
Can't you use the same argument that you made to exclude the possibility of a best possible world to similarly exclude the possibility of a most perfect God? By saying whatever defines the perfection, there could always be an increment to that.
No. The goodness of a being is not to be measured by the quantity of the goodness of the effects he produces. A perfect being will be as good as a being can be if he just makes a lot of goodness, because although the effect of his perfection would be greater, he wouldn't be any the more perfect for making that.
So you are defining God's perfection strictly in terms of God's goodness?
He is perfectly wise in the sense that he knows all true propositions, and he's perfectly powerful in the sense that he can do anything, but perfection in this context is usually meant by moral perfection. What I'm doing actually is spelling out the notion of God in a coherent way. And clearly it's part of God being who he's supposed to be, that he's very good. Now the question is how you spell that out. And if I'm happy with spelling it out as his being perfectly good, but then I want to understand perfectly good in a coherent way. And if one tried to understand perfectly good as making the best of all possible worlds, then that wouldn't be a coherent way. But if you would understand it as making lots of good things and doing nothing bad, then that is a coherent way. The best of all possible beings will be omnipotent, omniscient, and perfectly good. He's morally perfect. If he does nothing bad, everything he does is good. He does a lot of good. I can't see any sort of further coherent sense in which he could be more perfect than that.
Richard strives for coherence in his theology, meaning that each of God's traits must be consistent in itself and not contradict any of God's other traits. Yet if there is no perfect world, because there could always be one better, how could God's goodness be perfect if God could always do more good? To Richard, the goodness of a being is not measured by the quantity of goodness it produces, so that even if God would do more good, God would not be more perfect. I follow the logic. But here's what bothers me about God's perfection. God can neither grow nor change, so that it is impossible for God to learn or develop. Which is the greater perfection? Knowing everything always, or learning, developing evermore? How would an evangelical philosopher address God's perfection? I go to Biola University in Los Angeles to ask, J.P. Moreland.
J.P., why does God have to be perfect?
Well, I'm not sure that's the right question.
It's my question.
Well, yeah, bless your heart. The question isn't why does he have to be, but what does it mean for him to be? So when we describe God as perfect, we mean that the attributes that he possesses, his being wise and kind and gentle and just and fair, he possesses these to a degree such that it's impossible for him to have them to a greater degree.
That means that God cannot improve in these categories.
That's right.
Now, to me, that might be an imperfection because you can't get better.
In fact, the medieval theologians said that there are a lot of things that we can do that God can't do. For example, I can grow in courage. He can't. I can run a 100-yard dash. He can't. But of course, in the next breath, they said, this really isn't a limitation on God, it's a limitation on me, because the only reason that I can grow in courage is because I don't have all I could have. The only reason I can run a 100-yard dash is because I'm not at all the places in space at the same time.
Let's talk about God's development.
Yes.
Because God has certain stages, because you didn't exist forever.
That's right.
And now there's a sphere of existence in which J.P. Moreland
That's
exists. Right. So in God's perception of things, God has changed, or God has, I would say, improved because J.P. Moreland has come into existence.
Well, I think what we have to do is to try to explain how a being could be self-contained and still have experiences that are meaningful and enjoyable to God. It's almost like adding 50 to infinity doesn't increase infinity. So I would say that God's life is enriched by my presence, but not as I would be enriched, in the sense that with the privation of that enrichment, there's something lacking that makes my life less perfect.
I think the problem comes in how you're defining perfection, because there is a tendency sometime to define perfection as changeless.
Well, God is not static. When God creates the world, he dynamically interacts with it. He derives joy from interacting with us, enjoying his creation.
So you're defining perfection as something that is as perfect as it can be now, but it becomes a better perfection, like a higher level of infinity?
Well, the concepts of better don't apply to it, because the concept of being better only applies to a finite. All those things represent changes in God, but they don't represent growth or improvement in some way such that he's not perfect.
So the God that you believe in would be as legitimate a God, as a proper recipient of worship, even if God never did anything but just remained in this pre-creation condition, just with the God and whoever else is
in fact, only that kind of a God is worthy of complete worship, and here's why. Suppose God were capable of improving, and suppose that my worship of God was directed toward his worthiness, his excellence. And I was worshiping him, but I knew that in 15 years he would be smarter and better and kinder, and he would have grown. Well, then my worship should grow as well, so that the worship I would give him now should be limited. It's only a maximally perfect being that is incapable of improving that would be worthy of my total allegiance. Otherwise, I ought to hedge my bets a bit, knowing that maybe down the road I should be worshiping him more fully, because he'll be better than he is now.
You might hold back a little bit.
Right.
So God intrinsically is unchanging in perfection, but extrinsically, God is not static and does change. Nice, J.P. You keep God perfect, and you get God moving. You're threading a needle. Now, where am I? As much as I'd like to accept all this, I remain uneasy and fear games with words. Because if God exists, human standards of perfection would seem rather irrelevant to the reality of God. Moreover, because God's perfection would be absolute, it could also be brittle. Could God's perfection withstand the critique of a skeptic? I ask moral philosopher Walter Sinnott-Armstrong, who relishes debates with theists.
I would think a perfect God would have to be all-powerful and all-good, for example. And those are the ones that are incompatible with the existence of evil. A perfect God would also have to exist at all times equally and be unchanging, because if God changed, then why would God change? If God was perfect to begin with, what's the point of the change? And so if God is unchanging, then God, however, can't bring about new events in the world, can't bring about changes in the world, like answering prayers and causing miracles. But then, wait a minute, God's not perfect because God's not all-powerful anymore. So it's not clear to me that you can get a coherent notion of a God that is perfect in the sense that I think most believers want God to be perfect.
So maybe the problem is that theologians have tried to impose a concept of perfection which is inherently illogical, and they're trying to harmonize things that can't happen, and they're creating a logical contradiction.
I think there's something to that. And then the additional complication comes from the mix of traditions. When you look at the New Testament in particular, you're getting influences from the Hebrew Bible and the Jewish tradition that went before, getting combined with Greek influences, which are using notions of infinity and other worlds outside of time. And you put those two traditions together into a single book, and you get additional incoherences within the doctrine.
So maybe the struggle with this concept of God's perfection leads us to begin to examine within the religious traditions what the elements are that are really important and what are not. So I think it's a helpful exercise, not in just asking the question, but in probing what is the nature of the God that people are trying to believe in.
Right, but the problem is once you start saying, well, which is the part that really matters, right, now you're compromising. What happened to perfection? Perfection's not supposed to be a compromise. It's supposed to have it all.
Right. Well, something has to be weakened, right, in order to make this coherent.
Right, but from my perspective, to say something has to be weakened is simply to say you got to give up on the idea of perfection.
You have to give up on this manufactured definition of perfection, not necessarily giving up on God.
But remember, it wasn't me that manufactured it. It was Anselm and the medieval theologians. When they talked about perfection, they meant all of these things I've been talking about mixed together into one package.
Sure.
If you give up on some of those things and say those weren't really perfections after all, then we have to look at the individual case and say, why isn't that a perfection? Why doesn't that matter?
Or that if perfection is not something in our definition of perfection that we have to require.
Sure, you can say God is not perfect. I mean, look, the ancient Greeks said that. Zeus wasn't perfect. The Hindus say that. Shiva's not perfect.
There's a difference. I'd prefer, not to deal with that word because it has its own connotations.
That's fine with me. I'd be happy to give up the word perfect. It's the theologians who want to claim that God is perfect, not me. There really are different...
Walter Wheel's withering arguments. God's perfection, not with the horrors of this world, not with God incapable of change. Is this a problem with only God's perfection, or does it undercut theism in general? Can a perfect God create an imperfect universe? So if God exists, perhaps God is not so perfect, not so humanly perfect. Perhaps God's perfection is not human perfection on steroids. I returned to Oxford to inquire of the former Regius Professor of Divinity, Keith Ward. Keith, as a believer, you would ascribe the word perfection to God.
Yes.
And as this universe is the expression of that God's creativity, what is it about this universe that is perfect?
The elegance and intelligibility of the fundamental laws of this universe, the beauty of the universe that is seen, the possibilities for human creativity and freedom. Right, now here it gets complicated because you say, well, it can and it has all gone wrong. Okay, so that if you allow creativity, then you also allow for people not to be creative, for people actually to be destructive. If you allow freedom, you allow the misuse of freedom. So what is perfect is the process of creative freedom. But that, ironically, paradoxically perhaps, involves imperfection because it's bound to be the case that it can be misused. That's the universe, not God. Okay?
So a perfect God creates an imperfect universe?
Yes, necessarily.
Other than creating a universe in which there is creative freedom, what other characteristics of God would you put under the topic of God's perfection?
Well, I can think of three. One is what's traditionally called power, and I'd say that's creativity, creative power to do new things. One is consciousness, in the sense of complete appreciation and enjoyment of all beautiful things, which is traditionally called simply knowledge. And the third is community, that is to say that God's relational being, so that God will share personal being with other finite persons. So love, in other words, is the chief characteristic of relations.
And not only the existence of evil, but the extent of evil in the world does not diminish in any sense your feeling that God is perfect?
No, it doesn't. If you make a sort of array of all logically possible states of affairs, then some of these are going to be very evil. And you're not going to be able to eliminate that. They're going to be logically possible states of affairs. Now, God, on this scheme, would select some of those states of affairs for existence. And, of course, God would select the best ones for himself, if you want to put it that way, right? So God would be perfect. And God might select other possibilities, universes, because of the goodness they exhibit. It's a bit like the multiverse theory. In fact, in Augustine, it's called the principle of plenitude, really, that God will create every possible sort of good thing that God can create.
That's part of God's perfection.
That's part of God's perfection, yeah. So if you put it that way, God is going to involve both being perfect, i.e. perfectly beautiful and conscious in the divine being, but also God is going to create other beings which have a lesser degree of perfection because they're still good.
And how much of this does God have to do to remain perfect?
Well, I don't know everything about God, Robert. I'm not quite sure. But I think you could certainly say God would be prevented by the divine nature from creating an evil universe. So there couldn't be a universe of unutterable evil. Which, of course, some people would say there is one, and that might be the problem. But on this view, every universe that God created would have to be overwhelmingly good.
For God to be worshipped, I'm told, God must be perfect. But if a creator God truly exists, human standards of perfection won't work. Because God's perfections can conflict. Take God's perfect power and God's imperfect creation. Also, the power and freedom to grow in knowledge is good. But if God already knows everything ever, God cannot ever grow in knowledge. I resist a static God. In conflicts of perfections, I'd go for growth. So I'm bothered. Something's ajar with God's perfection. I recall what philosopher-theologian Philip Clayton said to me.
In some sense, God was not God until God was in relationship.
That seems to diminish God.
But Robert, that's the question. A God diminished by relationship is not a God worth having. Some God that exists in timeless perfection, not needing anything outside himself, is an abysmal moral model. But a God that is relationship would be a God that pervades all that is, a God related to the world rather than, well, useless to the world. Drop the notion of perfection. We don't need that. I do think that a God of incredible power who limits power in order for us as finite agents to exist, in order for a world to exist, that's a self-limiting God. I think that's a beautiful notion. Why not have that as our highest model of divinity?
So how perfect must God be to be closer to truth?
For complete interviews and for further information, please visit closertotruth.com.